Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Landscapes Live. This week, we are really pleased to host Julia Cisneros for a talk about bedforms, everything about bedforms, what we can read into them, what we can learn from them, when we still have to decipher about them. Before we start, before I introduce Julia, a quick note that we're also accompanied by Elena Serra, Marceline Péan. We're two new members of Landscapes Live, who will be the co-host today, together with Pedro Val and myself. The talk is recorded, of course, and you know that if you're looking at it on YouTube right now. And if you're on YouTube already, you have already seen our vast collection of seminars. And before we start, so next week will be the penultimate talk before EGU, and we will have Yaquan Chang, who will take us to the Hengduan Mountains to talk about tectonogeomorphic controls on plant biodiversity. But for the moment, let's welcome Julia, who joins us from Virginia Tech, where she's assistant prof since 2023. After doing her postdoc at UT Austin, which was a return home for her being a Texan, she had done a PhD away from Texas at Urbana-Champaign, where she already worked on the morphology of bedforms. We really have the world's expert with us today, working on bedforms since she started university. And she started university in Texas, at Texas A&M for a bachelor. But right now, I'm going to stop talking, give the floor to Julia. Please go ahead.
Hi, well, thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for being here, for your time and for your attention. I really appreciate it. So I want to share about my research and the work that we're doing in my research group, the Bedform Dynamics Research Group at Virginia Tech. The title is Shaped by Nature, Bedforms as Windows into Environmental Systems. And so I have this sort of, I think I have this reputation, and it doesn't help that I also have a secret identity, which is Dr. Dune. That's kind of what happens when you're just obsessed with these things called bedforms, on land, underwater, everywhere. And this is a really great group, super scientists that work to engage young people and the public to learn about science and to see scientists as superheroes. And I'm very fortunate that they chose me and created my Dr. Dune character. But as a kid, thinking about a superhero, I think this is a pretty cool superhero to be. And so this kind of summarizes what I've done thus far in my career and my research. And really the reason I'm so obsessed with these things, these bedforms, is because we've begun to find that they actually can tell us a lot more than just, hey, there's sand here and it's moving and it's being moved by wind or water. They can tell us a lot of the nuances about the environmental conditions that they're forming under and how those conditions are changing. And so the major question of this talk and of the work that I've been doing thus far is what can the shape of dunes, their morphology, tell us about the environmental conditions that they're forming in? And you may be sitting there and wondering, why are dunes so important? Well, hopefully by the end of this, I'll convince you that dunes and bedforms are very important for a lot of different reasons. First, bedforms we see exist in a range of environments. And so here, these are some images of aeolian dunes in deserts, White Sands National Monument here in New Mexico in the US. These are an image of fluvial dunes in this top right image that we can see exposed in this river because this river is a tidally influenced river in Nova Scotia. And you can see these dunes at the bottom of the river since the water levels are low here. And of course, these are current ripples that we see over a sand bed, maybe, in a beach or something like that. And so these are all different types of bedforms that we can see in different environments. And in the modern, today, in rivers especially, which is mostly what we'll talk about today, dunes that are composed of sand, alluvial dunes, when they're in rivers and when they're moving and migrating, they are the major movers of sediment across continents and to the coasts. So when we think about, the sedimentary system from source to sink and how that material moves through that system, through those transport zones, they move dominantly through rivers and they move as sand dunes. And so understanding that helps us get a handle on larger scale things like landscape evolution. In the sedimentary record, I have to bring it up. I am a trained geologist, first and foremost. The cross stratification that is produced by dunes and their migration is one of the most common depositional products from rivers. In fact, when we're out in the field and we're looking for evidence of an ancient river, this is what we're looking for. We're looking for cross stratification, and we use things like the size of the sets and to tell us about, the size of the paleoflow and thus the river and the amount of water it was moving in order to create that feature. And so this is an image. This is a video up here on the top right of cross stratification being developed in a really thin, small flume. This is work by Jack Brown at University of Illinois in a senior thesis, trying to understand how that cross stratification develops through different cases like superimposition. And then this is a pretty famous model from Rubin and Carter showing a very simple example of 2D dunes moving and the cross stratification that they create. And in this bottom image, this is a picture of cross stratification seen in the field along the banks of the Amazon River. And you can see that there's a little Write in the Rain notebook to give you an idea of the size. But generally, these lines that are inclined are telling us, hey, that's a dune, and it's recording that forward migration. And we can use that information to think about what that ancient environment looked like. Now, in order for dunes to form, sediment has to be moving along the bed, right? So we think a lot about sediment transport, and in this talk, we're just going to talk very broadly about it. We're going to talk about, bedload transport, which is sediment that moves along the bed. So here we have a zoom in, things like rolling along the bed or sort of hopping along the bed, but generally there's interaction with the bed, and that's what we call bedload transport. Whereas sediment that's moving dominantly in the flow within the water column, that's what we would call a suspended sediment transport. And so we'll separate those two as our two transport modes. And so as that sediment's moving and it's building up and creating these piles of sand, we see transitions in bedform development. In particular, I'm going to show you this video that starts at the very beginning, the initiation of motion of sediment moving. And we'll see how through that process, through increasing flow velocity, you get the development of different types of bedforms, depending on flow velocity and thus the sediment transport. And so here in this video, you can see it's a 1 millimeter sand, so a pretty basic sand. We have no motion really, so water's moving through this flume from right to left, and it's just barely getting motion. The sediment's moving. Now sediment starts to be moved, and we have the development of these smaller features, these smaller bedforms like ripples. And as that flow velocity increases, you can see that these ripples begin to move faster and they're starting to grow. And we continue to increase that flow velocity. And what we'll see is the development of dunes in this case, in this small flume here. And you can see that they're moving forward and moving all of that sediment through this flume. And so this transition in bedform types is well described in figures like this. So this is a bedform stability diagram, and what it tells you is depending on grain size and flow velocity, we will develop different types of bedforms. So in this case, we had a 1 millimeter sand, so 0.1 millimeter sand, so on the higher end of very fine. And, you know, we had no movement, so it's a flat bed, and then we increase movement, so increase flow velocity, we get ripples, and then we increase that movement and that flow velocity even more, and we get the development of dunes. And so what this allows us to do is connect what we see in the modern and what kind of bed form we're seeing to a grain size and to an energy, a flow, right? And so this ends up being really helpful in bridging across modern day, what we're seeing process-wise, and how those features are deposited and recorded in the record. In particular, as a sedimentologist, when you're looking at the rock record, I tell my students this, grain size tells you a lot, right? We already can have something on one axis, and then we can say, oh, what do we think this feature is recording? Is it a ripple? Is it a bed? Is it a dune? And then maybe we can go up and figure out what that flow velocity was as well. So it ends up being really helpful. These diagrams, these bed form stability diagrams, have dominantly been created through efforts like this. So this is a view of flume, of a big flume, looking in the bottom, figure 45, looking down upstream of the flume, and then in this top picture, looking in the sidewall. And so these are, you may be familiar with these. These are really famous experiments from Guy Simons and Richardson, an effort in the USGS to get an understanding of bed form development over a range of conditions. And these experiments and the morphologies and the bed form types that we're seeing were dominantly used to create these bed form stability diagrams. And they're very valuable, you know. A lot of the information we have on lee side angle comes from these kinds of images here, looking at sidewall views. But the one thing that I think is important to remember about these experiments is a lot of this was through visual observation, through looking from the top after you drain the flume or looking at the sidewall. And in order to have that visual observation, these experiments were limited to bed load transport conditions. Because if there was suspended sediment in the water column, you wouldn't be able to see through the sidewall, for example. And so what this effort has given us is a general idea of morphology of these bed forms. And so we're going to talk about river dunes. Here we have a general view, a general look at what a dune morphology, what the features of a dune are. So we have flow going from left to right. And you can see the gently sloping part is the stoss. Then we have the top of the dune, the crest. Then we'll have the downstream steeply sloping section called the lee side. And then the bottom of the dune is called the trough. And this lee side is often thought to be sloping at around 30 degrees, the angle of repose. And a key feature here is as flow moves up the stoss and over the crest, you can see that these lines are showing you flow lines, and flow compresses as it moves over the crest, it speeds up. And then in this area of the lee side, flow detaches and reattaches somewhere further down on the following dune stoss side. And in this area of the lee side, we get this flow recirculation zone. And so this flow recirculation zone actually becomes really important because it produces things like this next video here. This is from Mark Schmeckley's YouTube, looking at flow over a dune. And you can see the flows going sort of like into the page towards the right. And in this video, you can see the blue is this slow flow and the red is fast flow. And you can see this increase in flow velocity over the stoss side. But what you can really see is this recirculation zone. And if the video is looking good to you, if you can see it and it's clear, you can see that there is this shear layer that's developed as flow advects off of that crest near that detachment zone. And so this lee side angle becomes a really important feature in flow in that lee side is an important feature in creating turbulence and advecting flow and thus advecting sediment into the water column. And in some cases in big rivers, when these dunes are bigger and that flow circulation is an even bigger area, We even see the turbulence advected in the shear layer off of this area. We see turbulence even moving through the water column, and we see a surface feature of that turbulence boiling up as sort of boils coming up at the water surface. And so you can imagine this creates a lot of turbulence, but also flow resistance. And so these bedforms are a feature that are creating roughness in the flow. Now, lee sides are also important and turn out to be something that a lot of biologists think about in rivers. This is a screenshot from Carrie Elliott's work, USGS Water Science Center in Missouri in 2020, where she's showing that in this image on the top, you have these big dunes, you have these big flow recirculation cells, and it turns out that this is a pretty good spot and creates fish refugia. Carrie, a lot of the group there, they're really interested in things like sturgeons habitat. These are endangered species, endangered fish in the Missouri River, and the idea is that they hang out in this area where they're a little bit protected from the flow, and that's where they want to be. That's where they want to hang out, maybe lay their eggs, creates a really good habitat. Whereas if dunes don't have that flow recirculation zone in their lee side, that protective area, sturgeon aren't going to want to be there, and they're going to move on and try to find a different habitat where they can be protected and buffered from these faster flows. Another reason dunes are important, and this may be surprising to you and it may not be surprising to you, is they have a pretty big impact and can have a big impact on our global economy. So rivers that connect coastal areas all the way to inland zones on continents are very important navigational channels. Ships travel daily through some of these channels, the River Vaal in the Netherlands, the Mississippi River, for example. And these ships, they're traveling, they're transporting goods back and forth. And in cases where, we have big floods, for example, high flows, water levels are increasing, dunes can also grow during that period of time. And when those dunes grow, they grow with increasing flow. But then when that flood is done and those water levels begin to decrease, the dunes they're delayed in their response. And so there can be a moment after a flood where water levels are decreasing, but the dunes are staying large. And sometimes there can be critical water levels that are reached that are maybe not predicted or not really known, where in the channel you can have areas of higher aggradation and create hazards within the channel where maybe ships can run into the tops of dunes. And so it turns out that understanding this relationship and trying to identify local areas of higher aggradation is a really important factor in ensuring safe navigation through these channels. And so all of this are some examples of why it's important to study dunes, but you may be wondering, how do we see these bedforms, especially in rivers? They're underwater. And so we use a few different techniques in the field. We use multi-beam echo sounder surveys. So this is a view of a echo sounder image. So this is a ship that has this system below it. The system sends out sound waves in a sort of fan. And the sound waves, the time it takes to travel down, hit the bed and come back, tells us the distance. And so you can imagine that these boats with these systems sort of run up and down the river. And as they're covering, almost like mowing the lawn, they're revealing the bathymetry of these rivers. And we use those types of systems to get three-dimensional bathymetry of rivers in the field. But in the lab, a lot of efforts have been done to do things like laser scanning, using three-dimensional cameras to get really good scans of three-dimensional bathymetry of these features of these bedforms as they're developing in a more controlled environment, like a laboratory experiment. Other methods, you can use single line echo sounders, of course, which will give you a profile, and then there are some efforts doing especially dominantly in the Aeolian world as well, doing structure for motion from tons of images from drones and things like that to create DEMs as well. And so there's lots of different methods, but these are the two that will dominantly look at data from the field and from the lab. And so doing this and creating these three-dimensional images, getting a really good idea of the bathymetry of these systems has shown us a lot. And these are a few of the things that we can say, particularly about the morphological complexity of these features. And so what we can say is these dunes, they have a complex shape, and their lee sides are often segmented. It's not that simple image I showed you with a really simple straight stoss and a straight lee side, a simple dune profile. If we were to take a profile of a dune, for example, like across this one with this line here, other people have been doing this for a while. For example, Julie Roden in her 98 thesis did a ton of measurements using single line echo sounders in the Brahmaputra to show that the dunes in these systems don't have that very simple lee side. Often they have two segments, for example, whereas Alice Lefebvre in the Paranal River measured tons of dunes across single profile lines and has found so many different shapes that they can have. And this is a sort of summarizing image of her findings where, hey, the stoss side and the lee side aren't these simple straight lines. There's a lot of different segments and different shapes that they can have. And so there's complexity in their morphology. Multiple scales of bedforms can also exist in these systems. And when we see that, they're often superimposed on one another. And so this is an image from Ariane Riesink and Riesink Bridge in 2007, where they're showing that, hey, you can have these smaller bedform features, like maybe a ripple climbing over this larger dune. And we can see that even in this image here, where we have these ripples here climbing over this larger dune, this larger bedform. And so given that we have, these beautiful three-dimensional bathymetry now from all of these great methods and multi-beam echo sounders and laser scanners, and that we recognize that there is this morphologic complexity that needs to be better understood, I created the bedform analysis method for bathymetric information. So what Bambi does is it measures these bedforms across the extent of the river of the multi-beam data set. So this is an image of Paranal River multi-beam, and it measures the dunes. It measures things like their heights, their wavelengths, the flow depth that they're existing in, but it also measures their lee side angle, their mean, the mean angle, the maximum angle, and it gives us an idea of that shape as well. And so doing this allows us to get this sort of three-dimensional view of these dunes across the entire spatial extent of these multi-beam maps, instead of relying on single profiles through the dune. And so what this has allowed us to do is really increase the amount of measurements and thus the amount of information we have on dune variability in these systems. And there's been a ton of different methods that have been used and created recently, and a group of us led by Leon Schreiber came together to compare our different methods, and we found, hey, they all work pretty well. Some work better than others in different environments, and that makes sense because the methods that were created for a specific environment, maybe a tidal environment, maybe an Aeolian environment, a deep sea environment, in my case, rivers. But what we can say is that Bambi is well suited for analyzing processes depending on dune shape, like near-field hydrodynamics, sediment transport, and the generation of turbulence in particular, because of how it measures the complexity, the interaction of multiple scales of bedforms, and the shape of those bedforms. And so to give you an idea of what we're looking at in this image, I'm zooming in here. Each one of these points, it looked like lines. I think maybe you might have thought those were lines. Each one of these points is measuring the dune along the from bank to bank. And so you could imagine we're measuring the dunes along, if you want to think about it this way, profiles that are spaced at the resolution of the data set. And so what Bambi does really uniquely is it measures this lee side complexity. And so this is a quick description of this depiction. If it's a simple dune, Bambi will measure the mean and the max angle, and it'll report values that look like this. You know, we have a mean and a max. They're the same value because this is a simple straight line lee side angle, and so those two values are parallel to each other. Whereas if it's a weird shaped dune, something with multiple segments, Bambi will still measure the average slope, but it also identifies that maximum slope along the lee side as well. And it tells us where that maximum slope is. It tells us, you know, in this case, that the maximum slope's at the top of the dune, or the maximum slope is at the bottom of the dune. And so this really allows us to look at some of these features with more detail. And so doing this in the world's big rivers was a great opportunity. And so when I created Bambi, it was a great time to reach out and to a lot of groups who had been creating and processing and going out to the field and acquiring all these beautiful multi-beam data sets, the Mississippi, the Missouri here in the US, the Mekong, the Paraná in 2 different locations, the Vaal River in the Netherlands, and then the Amazon River. And you can see that these are all different types of rivers, different scales. I have flow is pointing downwards in every image, but these bars here are telling you the relative size. So each bar, the width is representing 100 meters. You can imagine a totally crazy range. So you have, you know, a huge spatial area in the Mekong, whereas, you know, the Mississippi is a smaller area. And running Bambi on all of these and looking at what the bedforms look like across these different types of rivers, these big rivers of the world, has shown us that dunes in the world's big rivers are characterized by having low angle lee side slopes and having this complex shape. And so I'm going to briefly show you what I mean by that, just by another set of depictions, because I think that's the easiest way to show you. I have the data, I promise. I can show you the data, but I think images sometimes are just better to get the idea across. And so here, in terms of morphologic complexity, what we see in these big rivers, and this is across the board for all of these dunes, what we see is, you know, hey, we thought dunes looked like this. They have this high sloping lee side angle, about 30 degrees, that angle of repose. And what we see is that's not necessarily true. In these rivers, the dunes are dominantly around 10 degrees, their lee side angles. And so they are lower in their angle than previously assumed. When we think about their shape, again, we think about them as simple triangles, right? The simple stas, simple lee, you know, simple triangle here. And when we look at their shapes of their lee sides, we see that they have multiple segments. And the steep slope, what some people may call the slit face, what we call the steepest slope, is near the base of the dune lee side angle. It's near the bottom half of the dune lee side angle. And finally, in terms of their size, their heights, we see that this is what people previously assumed. We make relationships about the dune size in relation to its flow depth, and often we assume that, hey, the dune is about 1/3 of the flow depth. And we use that for things like paleohydraulic reconstructions. What we see in these big rivers is dunes are much smaller than we previously assumed in relation to their flow depth. They're still big dunes, but in relation to their flow depth, they're smaller. So in the case of big rivers, dune heights are about 1/10 of the flow depth. And so I want to focus on this case here, this 10-degree case. The fact that we see low-angle dunes in these big rivers is a very interesting piece of information, because a lot of people have been thinking about, you know, what kind of flow occurs, what kind of flow dynamics occurs over low-angle dunes, because low-angle dunes have been identified and observed previously in some cases. And when we talk about flow over low-angle dunes, the thing that we know is that there's a lack of, or sometimes an intermittent zone of flow separation over that lee side. So this is a video here where I'm showing you a rotating wing. So the wing starts initially flat at a low angle, and you can see that there is no flow separation over that wing. And as that wing increases in its angle, you can see that a flow separation zone begins to form, and as that angle gets larger, it increases, it becomes bigger. And so this work and previous work has looked at this, and the consensus is that permanent flow separation is absent for dunes that have lee side angles less than 10 degrees. And if you remember, in big rivers, most of those dunes have lee side angles at or below 10 degrees. And so what this has shown us is that the morphological characteristics that we see in these big rivers and the influence that they have on fluid flow, dominantly that low angle dune, have profound implications for how we model flow, how we predict flow resistance in these systems, and even how we recognize these rivers and the deposits that they will have in the rock record. And I'll focus for this one just on flow. This is a series of models, the outputs of turbulent kinetic energy from Alice Lafair and Christian Winter, where they're looking at flow over a 10-degree dune, a 20-degree dune, and a 30-degree dune. And you can see with this deep red color, that just means that we have higher turbulent kinetic energy. And there's a disconnect here, because in this case, 10 degrees, this is what we should expect to see for flow over dunes and big rivers. Whereas this is how we're modeling flow over those dunes currently. And so this is, requires that we think more about how we incorporate or sort of reassess these models. But Alice and I, we've taken this a bit further from that work to think about, we know that there's morphologic complexity in these systems. We know that these dunes have a morphologic complexity. So how does that also influence flow? And what we've been able to show is that we can separate dunes, bedforms, into 3 different classes based on the flow dynamics that they experience and their lee side angles and their shapes. So what we've done is we've separated 3 cases, what we call low angle dunes, that are dunes with lee side angles less than 10 degrees. These are dunes that experience no flow separation. Sometimes, depending on the steep slope, if it is a very, very, very high steep slope, like more than 20 degrees, and if it's at the very bottom of the dune, then it may experience a little zone of flow separation. High angle dunes, these are cases where dunes have lee sides greater than 20 degrees, and these dunes will always experience permanent and fully developed flow separation. And in the middle, we have these intermediate angle dunes that are between 10 and 17 degrees. And these guys, it really depends on what that angle is and where that steep slope is as to whether they are experiencing flow separation or not. But in all cases, we see evidence that there is intermittent flow separation. So sometimes there is no flow separation, sometimes there is. And the reason we can't completely say if it's intermittent is because these are Reynolds average Navier-Stokes flow models. So in order to really get a handle on that, we need to expand to time resolved characteristics. And this is an example of something that we may want to dive deeper in to better understand what the flow dynamics is in these really interesting intermediate angle dunes. What we can say is that turbulent wakes exist across these dunes, but their shear layers are different. They're shorter, they're a little bit thicker, but in order to really understand their impact and their intermittency, we need to dive deeper into those. And overall, what this requires is that we reassess how we incorporate flow separation into models that seek to predict things like flow depth and water levels and flood risk, because we see dominantly in big rivers, at least, things like low and intermediate angle dunes, and not so much these high angle dunes. Now, with all of that being said, we know that there's this complexity and we're able to describe it and all of these things and maybe show a little bit of how that complexity impacts things like flow dynamics. But on the other end, I want to ask, how can we use these dune shape parameters, these parameters that describe that complexity, to understand the mechanisms that lead to their complexity? Why do low angle dunes form? Why are they there? And so in order to do that, in order to investigate the controls on dune lee side angle, we need to have an opportunity to look at how dunes are forming under pretty similar conditions just by tweaking one thing at a time. And in this case, these are experiments from Bradley and Vendetti in 2019, where they ran experiments across a range of sediment transport cases, transport stages, but keeping everything else the same. So slope the same, flow depth the same, and just ramping up the pump. So going from a case of, threshold and bedload sediment transport, something that looks like this, versus increasing in suspended sediment flux until we are in a suspended sediment dominated case, something that looks like this. And so being able to look at some of these very controlled experiments may give us an opportunity to sort of figure out and tease out what are the controlling factors that lead to the formation of low angle dunes. So these experiments, these were run over 10 hours after equilibrium was reached. Maps of the bed were taken every 10 minutes. And so for each one, we have 60 maps. And what I'm going to show you is how we can use these maps and running Bambi across all of these maps and understanding what the morphology is as we go through these different transport controls, how we can use that to kind of tease out what those controlling mechanisms are for low angle dune formation. And so there are a few mechanisms that have been thought to lead to the formation of low angle dunes. The first here is, we'll focus on just two of them. The first is the impact of sediment suspension. And then the second is the impact of bedform superimposition. So one is, okay, hey, maybe we have so much sediment in suspension that it changes things like flow dynamics and the settling of sediment or the bypassing of sediment. Whereas the other is, hey, maybe we have these multiple scales of bedforms and they can influence each other and change the shape of each other such that we continue to form a lower angle bedform. And so I'm going to talk about both of these in detail, but we're going to start with the sediment suspension case. So in sediment, sediment suspension as a controlling mechanism for low angle dune formation, the idea here is that more suspension occurs, or more extensive suspension occurs when this number here, U star over WS, is greater than 1. So U star, that's the shear velocity, and WS, that's the particle falling velocity. So this is essentially the ratio of sediments, the ability of the sediment to be picked up and thrown into suspension versus the rate that the suspension or that sediment is going to want to fall back to the bed. And so if that number is greater than 1, it means that, hey, that sediment is being picked up and thrown into the bed faster than it can drop down to the bed. So suspension is being more dominant, suspension is occurring. When this happens, the idea is that in this case, we have a low transport case, low transport stage, suspension is not really occurring here. And hey, we get that normal development of a normal dune. We have dunes moving, big circulation cell, turbulence advecting off of the lee side, and the continuance of that high angle dune. Whereas if we have a lot of suspended sediment in concentration near the bed, that suspended sediment could dampen the turbulence in that lee side, which would allow sediment, which is so concentrated in the flow, to settle out and to deposit in the lee side and the trough. But also all of that sediment and suspension may actually bypass deposition on the crest and not allow the dune to grow taller, and again continue to allow that dune to get into a lower angle. And so in order to do this, we can look at the lee side angles that are measured from Bambi across all of these experimental conditions. This is the plot that we're going to look at. So here we have suspension number on the X and lee side angle on the Y. And the colors are connected to the transport stage. So green is threshold, blue is bedload condition. This maroon and gray are lower mix and upper mix. So this is the case where we have bedload transport, but we're introducing more suspended load transport as well. And then the yellow is suspension dominated. So all the sediment is dominantly moving through suspended load. And then the different shapes are the different flow depth conditions. So these experiments were run in very shallow flows, things like 15 centimeters, 20 centimeters, and 25 centimeter flow depths. And so looking at the values that we have here, the lighter colors, the transparent colors are the individual measurements, the averages for each bed scan. And then the bolded symbols are the averages of each experimental case condition. And so what we can see is, if you look at all of the bed scans, we see a range of lee side angles that that we see across these cases from 10 to 30 degrees. And if we look at the trend of lee side angle through increasing transport stage, you can see that lee side angle increases through threshold to bedload, but then we see this decrease in lee side angle. And this decrease, I'm going to zoom in there, this decrease in lee side angle occurs just when we start transporting suspended sediment. So it occurs between the bedload and the lower mixed case, where suspended load flux increases from 0 to 70.8 grams per second per meter. And so just at that increase of suspension being transported, we already start to see a decrease in the lee side angle. And this occurs, I would like to point out, instead of at a suspension dominance, where we'd see the U star, the suspension number greater than 1, it's occurring just at that beginning of suspension being transported. The second mechanism that we'll look at is the influence of bedform superimposition. So in this case, the idea is that you can have these smaller bedforms moving over, climbing over the larger bedform. And if that small bedform is small, and in this case, the ratio is if that small bedform height is less than 0.25 of the large bedform height, it's just going to move over the crest, and then it's going to avalanche on the lee, and it's going to keep the promotion of that high angle lee side. Whereas if that small bedform is a little bit bigger, as it's moving over the large dune stoss and it gets closer to the crest, the flow recirculation of that smaller bedform in its lee side can create shear stresses that are high enough to start eroding the larger dune's crest. And through that process of erosion of the larger dune crest and then that smaller dune moving over and depositing on the lee side, we can start to lower the lee side angle in this case. And so in order to test this, we have to be sure that we're looking at a condition where only bedform superimposition is occurring and no sediment is being transported in suspension. And again, these experiments really lend themselves to doing this, because we can look at the threshold condition cases where we know no suspension is occurring. And so in this image here, it's a bit complicated. I'll walk you through it. On the left-hand side, panel A, we have lee side angle on the X versus time. And so we're going to look at a dune as it moves through time in these bedform, in these maps. You can see the maps highlighted for a couple of times here on the D panel. And in the middle, you can see these profiles taken from the center line. And so I've highlighted this dune here in yellow. And at time equals 160 minutes after equilibrium, you can see that this dune here is a normal, simple dune. It's just got a normal stoss and a steep lee side. And the lee side of that dune is shown here in blue. The value is 24 degrees. And through time, as that dune moves and migrates, at around 190 minutes, you see that superimposed dunes begin to form over that larger dune. And from 190 minutes to 220 minutes, you can see that those superimposed dunes that are forming over that large dune move across that large dune and move through. And through that time period, the lee side of that larger dune decreases from 24 degrees to 10 degrees. And so we can see that the lee sides of these larger dunes are responding to the movement and the influence of those smaller dunes that are moving over them and leading to that lowering of their lee side, likely through the erosions of the crest and just modulating that morphology. But what's interesting is that those superimposed dunes move through, they're no longer there, and you can see after that period of time from 220 onwards, the lee sides increase again once those superimposed dunes are gone. And so this decrease and increase in lee side angle is likely related to the migration rates of those smaller dunes. So it's a different time scale situation as well. But overall, we can see that the dune lee side angle begins to lower when superimposed dunes climb over those larger dunes. So when we think about the mechanisms that lead to low angle dune formation, we can say that both of these mechanisms can lead to the formation of low angle dunes. Maybe they occur in different ways and on different time scales. And so there's a balance between the two where when one is happening, the other one's less likely important or less likely dominant. And so we can use that to think about how we relate that to environmental controls. And we can say, okay, well, if superimposition is the dominating mechanism for low angle dune formation, we know transport stage is low. We can assume that grain sizes are coarser if it's the same flow conditions, because that's going to be a harder sediment to transport. So it's going to be a low transport case, lower mobility. And bed shear stresses are likely lower in this case. Whereas if suspension is the dominant mechanism for low angle dune formation, transport stages are high, grain sizes are probably finer, higher mobility, and bed shear stresses are higher as well. And so putting all of this together, we show that bedform morphology in big rivers provide a new insight on flow dynamics, things like flow depth relationships, paleohydraulic reconstructions, and the preservation of these systems. And we also reveal the presence of low angle dunes in deep flows, but also shallow flows. And doing that, we can say that the proposed mechanisms for low angle dune formation are sediment suspension and superimposition. And that really allows us to make links between bedform morphology and the environmental conditions that these bedforms are forming in. And so that concludes this talk, but I want to spend like 1 extra minute just to share you a bit about some of the emerging questions in the Bedform Dynamics Research Group. And so these are 4 projects that my group is working on. Frida Aranya, she's looking at the effects of urbanization and whether we can capture these effects through both channel morphology and bedform morphology in systems that are being heavily urbanized through things like land development, how that affects sediment type, size, composition, and whether we can say anything about the future of these systems. So she's working in Lake Austin, Texas, which is a part of an impounded section of the Colorado River in Texas. Daniel Alvarez is looking at the relationships and links between bedform dynamics, bedform morphology, the routing of sediment fluxes through meander bends, and whether we can link bedform morphology and dynamics to meander band dynamics. Elpidio Guzman de la Cruz is trying to figure out, can we use the same techniques that we do in rivers to start to understand and reveal some of the environmental conditions through bedform morphology in other systems, things like desert dune fields, in this case, Algodones dune field. And then Cora Jones is looking at a location, her hometown in North Carolina, where there are 2 sections of coastal dunes, one that is a heavily refurbished, heavily impacted area, and one that's a natural area. And she's trying to understand what the morphology of those 2 dune fields look like and whether we can say anything about the impacts or the resiliency of the dunes that are being affected by anthropogenic influences, and specifically the management strategies of coastal refurbishment. So with all of that, I want to say thank you for your time. I'm super happy to answer questions, and I'll leave my conclusion slide here.
Thank you so much, Julia. It was great. So the chat is open for your questions, or you can also, I see that Justin has raised his hand. Oh no, there was a clap. If you are clapping in the room, please type in your question in the chat. If you can only ask it verbally, we can also unmute you for this. Maybe giving you a bit of time to type in your questions, I will allow myself to start with the first one. Julia, you showed us as a motivation at the beginning that during floods, dunes tend to aggregate as well.
Yeah.
And we saw that for the low angle lee sides, we are in like potentially in a high transport stage with a pretty high ratio of U star over WF, if I remember correctly the terms. When these dunes are aggrading, do we have like steep dunes, or can these gentle dunes also aggrade the bed?
That's a great question. So in the case of these dunes aggrading, I can say that the example that we have, I have an extra slide I can show you. An example that we have is in the Vaal River, where we see that there's a big difference in dunes that are on the northern side of the channel versus the southern side of the channel. And a majority of that reason is because heavy ships, they travel from Rotterdam to Germany, and they travel low in the system. We think that because of that, they're suppressing the dune growth. Whereas when they travel back from Germany to Rotterdam, they're traveling higher because they're 52% of those ships are empty because they go drop everything off and go back. When we look at what those dunes look like through the flood, so in this case, I've looked at how dunes develop through a big flood and a smaller flood. And what we see is that their heights increase and their lee side angles increase as well. And this is kind of counterintuitive to what I've just told you, right? The case in this is that the Vaal River is a coarse sand river, and it's coarsening over time. And so what I think is, if you look at the case of the suspended sediment conditions here, I'll go back to that video or to that image. I think in the Vaal, at least, we're here still, where we're not moving, even in a peak flood, we're not moving past a bedload dominated case yet. So in order to figure out whether these low angle dunes can also aggrade, we have to be in a condition where the grain sizes are right, the mobility of that sediment is right, and we're hitting peak floods that we can actually see that transport stage transition. And that's easier said than done, right? It means that we got to be out there, taking surveys through floods, and we also have to be sure that we can actually do that. A lot of times, I don't know about you, but I don't want to be out on the river surveying through a big flood. That's really scary. So I think in this case, I'm not sure, and I think it's because we still can't see it. We can't observe that yet. Thus far, all we've been able to observe is, I think, this part of that transition. And what we see is, yes, the dunes grow in height and they increase in their lee side angle.
Okay, thank you. Elena, would you like to take Justin's question?
Yes. So Justin asked, how do dams on large rivers affect dune complexity? Is there any way to tell from looking at the dune shape from Bambi the extent to which a river is impacted by a dam?
Great question, Justin. I was just about to email you about this because I want to try to do this for some work. Yes, yeah. So, yes, we're working in Lake Austin. We're looking at this impounded river. And what we can say is, in these lowland rivers, sandy bedded rivers, we know that dams are going to do a couple things. They're going to modulate the flow. They're going to probably trap a lot of sediment as well. And what we see on the downstream side of those dams is, there's a coarsening of the bed. The bed material gets coarser, but then we also see towards the downstream dam, this fining trend, and we overall get the typical like reservoir sedimentation. And what we see through this is there's a very clear grain size transition through these systems. And when we look at the bed forms in these systems, what I would expect to see and what I've seen thus far, at least in this one case study, is there are very clear spatial distinctions between bedform morphology. We see big primary dunes in some cases and smaller simple dunes in others. We see the interaction of multiple scales of bed forms. And all of that has to do with the flow dynamics that they're experiencing and the spatial variation of grain size that they're forming through. In the coarser sediments, we'd see high angle dunes, and in the finer stuff, we see dunes become lower angle. And also we see a loss of those multiple scales of bed forms interacting. What's really interesting is that in these cases, a lot of times you have floods, you open the dams, flows moving through them, and then you're in a low flow condition again. And that impacted or dammed river sometimes is acting more like a lake. And so I think there's a lot to say there too, as to how those bed forms are acting in these systems and how they are, in fact, through their dynamics, creating a spatial variability of sedimentation through these, I guess what we call like reservoir systems as well. So yeah, there's a lot I think to say. And a part of what Afrida's doing is thinking about, and with urbanization and land development, how does the changes in the types of sediment, the types of sediment size and composition that development adds to the watershed and thus is transported into these systems, how does that also affect sediment fluxes, and how can we see that possibly recorded through bedform morphology as well?
Thank you, Julia. And a very interesting thank you from Justin Lawrence.
Great.
Do we have another burning question, Pedro, Marceline?
I would have one.
Go
Yeah.
ahead.
Thanks for the talk first. Yeah, so like a bit the question is at the end, you showed us at the beginning, like the idea we had about dune is that they have this simple shape with this 30-degree angle and so, and then somehow what you found out, it's actually not that simple. And like, how do you explain this? Is it because you are the first one that look at so many dunes and somehow previously we did not do that, or like did people look at other dunes, or how do you explain this?
That's a great question. I think that there's a lot to say there. So I said previously too that the work that we really relied on as to how we describe dunes came from these experimental cases where a lot of those cases are, small flumes, shallow flows, and bedload dominated cases. And what we can see from the experiments is, in the bedload dominated systems, we do see the high angle of repose dunes. And that could have just been, and so the fact that we didn't see low angle dunes in those cases is likely just a limitation of the technology back then. We now can start to look at systems with higher transport stage because we have better imaging technology. In the case of in the field, Julie Roden was measuring complex dunes in 1998 with a single line echo sounder. And so she was identifying these, but I think it's what you said is it's not that I'm the first one to do this, but what I've been able to do is to show the prevalence of these features and describe them in more detail and explicitly describe the spatial variability of these features. And I think that's the contribution that I've been able to make. But in no way am I the first one saying this. There's been, we stand on the shoulders of giants. So yeah, I think this is just a continuation of that work.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Julia. We're hitting the hour, so I will just echo the comment of Henrietta Ali, who is telling you that this was a very interesting presentation, and thank you very much for a great talk.
Thank you, Henrietta.
Stop the recording, but before I do that, just to let everyone know that next week we meet at the same time for a seminar by Yaquan Chang. who will bring us to the Hangwan Mountains to talk about technogeomorphic controls and on plant diversity. Thank you very much, Julia. Thank you, everyone, and see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.